Picture 8,000 candles burning at once in a single room. Now picture that room sealed shut, packed with 6,000 human bodies in wool and silk and fur, all of them sweating, all of them breathing the same air, while wax rains down from the ceiling like warm snow that burns when it lands. That's not a disaster. That's not an accident. That's a party. That's the most famous party France ever threw, and you are one of the boys who has to keep it from burning the whole palace down while it happens. Your hands are already ruined for it. That's the first thing anyone should understand about this work. Look at your fingers sometime. The callus is gone waxy and pale. The burns healed into little white islands across your knuckles. The black crescents under every nail that no amount of scrubbing with sand and vinegar will ever fully lift. You've been dipping and trimming and carrying candles since before you were tall enough to reach the workbench without a stool, and you will smell like tallow and beeswax until the day you die, however far you manage to climb. Tonight you will climb higher than you've ever climbed. Tonight you will stand on a narrow plank 30 feet above the most powerful people in Europe, holding a brass snuffer in one scalded hand, watching wax drip onto wigs worth more than your entire family will earn in 3 generations, and praying to a god you're not sure is listening that the whole gallery doesn't catch fire while the King of France dances below you dressed as a tree. That's not a metaphor. He is, quite literally, going to be dressed as a tree. So is his own son. So are 6 other men whose names you're not permitted to know yet. All of them identical. All of them clipped and green and shapeless, moving through a crowd of nymphs and shepherdesses and Turkish sultans and Chinese mandarins who have paid enormous sums of money and endured enormous discomfort for the privilege of not knowing which tree is the one who can have them executed on a whim. Welcome to Versailles, February of 1745. The whole court has been holding its breath for a wedding, and tonight, at last, it exhales. Your name is Julian IV. You're 15 years old, and you have worked in the candle stores of the Menus Plaisir, the department that handles the king's entertainments, his fireworks, his masquerades, his endless appetite for spectacle. For 3 years now, ever since your father, who mended harness leather for the royal stables, put in a word with a cousin who put in a word with someone else, and you were taken on as the smallest and most expendable pair of hands in a trade that runs entirely on wax, fire, and the threat of both. You did not choose this work so much as it chose you, the way most work chooses most people. But 3 years in, you've come to know it the way you know the back of your own scarred hands. You know that beeswax candles cost roughly 10 times what tallow candles cost, and that the difference in smell alone, honey and warmth against rancid animal fat, is why every room a noble might actually enter burns bees, and every room a servant might work in burns tallow, so that the poor quite literally breathe a different, worse-smelling air than the rich, floor by floor, room by room, all through the same building. You know that a single wax taper for the grand apartments takes the better part of an hour to make properly, dipped again and again in slowly cooling layers, and that Versailles alone burns through tens of thousands of them in a single winter month, when the court is in residence and the king wants his rooms bright past midnight. You know, too, that fire is the one thing this whole glittering machine is most afraid of. More afraid of than plague. More afraid of even the king's temper. Wood floors, silk hangings, wallpaper stiffened with wax and varnish, wigs powdered with flour that catches like tinder. enough candlelight in the state apartments on a single ordinary evening to set a small town ablaze, if it ever got loose. Master Robinet, who runs the candle stores and has run them since before your father was born, says it plainly to every new boy on his first day. The same words every time, like a prayer he's tired of saying but says anyway because it keeps people alive. Every candle in this palace is a small fire that we have agreed for now to let live in a jar. Forget that, and you'll learn it the hard way. Most boys only need to learn it once. The candle stores themselves sit in a low, thick-walled outbuilding tucked against the North Service courtyard, deliberately set apart from the main body of the palace by a distance the king's own architects worked out on purpose, decades ago, after a fire in an earlier storehouse taught them exactly why melted wax and open flame and stacked timber and canvas mouldings should never share a roof with anything the court actually lives in. You spend most of your working hours in a long room lined with copper vats, the air always faintly hazy with the smell of hot fat and warmer honey. The walls themselves stained a deep amber near the ceiling, from decades of candle smoke that no amount of scrubbing has ever fully lifted. In winter, it's the warmest room you have access to in the whole sprawling complex of service buildings, which is its own small mercy, and in summer it's nearly unbearable. The vats kept simmering regardless of the season, because Versailles never stops wanting light. Not for a single night of the year. There are perhaps 30 of you working under Master Robinet at any given time. Apprentices your own age doing the dipping and trimming, older journeymen managing the vats and keeping the accounts of how many pounds of wax the department has burned through this month against how many remain in store. A handful of women in a separate room entirely who do the finer decorative work, twisting coloured wax into ornamental tapers for the Queen's private apartments, work considered too delicate to trust to boys' clumsier hands. You've learned all their names over 3 years, learned which of the older journeymen will let you warm your hands at the vat rim on the coldest mornings, and which ones consider that a waste of working time. Learned the particular hierarchy of a trade that looks, from outside, like nothing more than melted fat and string, and turns out from the inside to have as many careful gradations of status and skill as any noble household above stairs. This week, that whole room has been turned entirely over to the Yew Ball. Every vat has been kept simmering from before dawn until well past dark. Every apprentice pulled off ordinary work to dip and trim the special order, every journeyman set to checking and rechecking the great chandelier chains that will carry it all 30 feet above 6,000 heads. Master Robinet himself has slept, by Thomas's estimate, perhaps 4 hours a night for the better part of 2 weeks, and it shows in the deeper hollows under his eyes, and the shorter fuse he's kept with anyone careless enough to waste good wax on a badly formed taper. He said it to you 3 years ago. He is saying it again tonight, louder, to a room full of exhausted apprentices at 4 in the afternoon, 6 hours before the doors open on the largest and strangest party any of you will ever work. Master Robinet is not a large man, but he has the kind of stillness that makes a room quiet when he walks into it. 40 years of handling open flame around silk and paper, having taught his body a kind of economy of movement. No sudden gestures, no fast turns, nothing that might knock a candle from its stand. His hands are scarred worse than yours, the burns older, whiter, layered one on top of another like the rings inside a tree. He has lost the last 2 fingers on his left hand, taken clean off years ago when a chandelier chain snapped and dropped 40 pounds of ironwork and burning wax straight down onto the platform where he was standing. He tells that story exactly once a year, always tonight, always before the biggest event of the winter, and always ending the same way. I was lucky it was only the fingers, he says, holding up the ruined hand for the newest apprentices to see properly, the way he's held it up every year you've worked under him, the scarred stump of each missing finger gone smooth and shiny with age now, no longer raw, the way you imagine it must have looked the year it happened. The boy working beside me that night wasn't so lucky. He kept both his hands. He lost the use of one leg instead, and he never worked a scaffold again after, not once, though the department found him a place minding accounts instead, which is more mercy than some masters would have shown him. I tell you this every year not to frighten you, though if it frightens you a little, that's not the worst thing a 15-year-old boy could feel the night before a masquerade this size. I tell you because I want you to understand in your bones, before you climb that scaffold tonight, that the chains you're checking are not a formality. They are the only thing standing between a beautiful evening and a night nobody in this room wants to live through twice. Tonight, gentlemen, he continues, we're hanging 8 new chandeliers in the Hall of Mirrors and lighting every branch of every one of them, along with every sconce on every pier glass between here and the chapel. If a chain fails tonight, it will not be over an empty platform. It will be over the heads of 6,000 people who cannot get out the doors fast enough, even if there were no fire at all. So you will check every chain twice. You will check every socket twice. And you will not, under any circumstances, let me catch you dozing on that scaffold no matter how long the night runs. Is that understood? It is understood. It is always understood. And yet every year, somehow, something goes wrong, because 6,000 candles and 6,000 overheated, jostling, drunk, magnificently dressed human beings in a sealed room is not a situation that wants to behave itself, no matter how carefully you plan it. You've spent the better part of the last 2 weeks readying for tonight, and your body carries the evidence of it. The pads of your fingers are pruned and softened from hours with your hands in warm wax, dipping and re-dipping the long tapers destined for the Hall of Mirrors, the finest candles the stores produce, pure white beeswax with wicks of tightly twisted cotton, each one meant to burn clean and bright for 6 or 7 hours without smoking or guttering, because the king does not want his mirrors filled with soot-streaked reflections of himself on the single most important night of his son's marriage celebrations. The work itself has a rhythm that gets into your body after enough repetition, the way any hard, repeated labour does. You dip the wick frame, a wooden rack strung with a dozen cotton wicks, down into the vat of melted wax. Hold it there for the count of 3, lift it clear, let it cool just enough that the new layer sets without cracking, then dip again. Down, hold, lift, wait. Down, hold, lift, wait. Your arms ache after the first hour and burn after the second. A deep muscular ache that settles into your shoulders and doesn't leave for days. The wax itself is somewhere between too hot to touch comfortably and cool enough to work. You learn the temperature by feel long before anyone teaches you the words for it. Learn it the way you learn anything painful and necessary, by getting it wrong enough times that your skin remembers even when your mind forgets. The smell never really leaves your clothes. Warm honey and something faintly smoky underneath it, mixed these last weeks with the sharper tang of the tallow candles you make for the servants' halls and the kitchens, animal fat rendered down and strained and poured. A smell that clings to the back of your throat if you breathe it too long in an unventilated room. Thomas, the other apprentice your age, says he can't smell either one anymore, that 3 years of this work has burned his nose out entirely, but you don't quite believe him. You think he's just gotten good at not mentioning it. Thomas is older than you by a year and taller by a head, with the kind of loose, easy confidence that makes the older journeyman tolerate him even when he's being lazy, which is often. He's from Paris, not from a village like you, and he never lets you forget it, not unkindly, just as a fact about the world the way you might mention the weather. He's the one who explains things to you, half the time, the things Master Robinet doesn't bother to say because he assumes everyone already knows them. You know why they're calling it the Yew Ball, Thomas said, 3 days ago, while the two of you were unpacking a fresh delivery of wax bricks in the storeroom, your breath fogging faintly in the cold air near the loading doors, because the costumes, the king's idea apparently. Everyone who's part of his set, and nobody outside that set is supposed to know who's in it, is going to be dressed as a clipped yew tree, green from head to foot, leaves, branches, the whole thing built up over a wire frame so you can't even see the shape of the man underneath. 8 of them, identical. Nobody's meant to be able to tell which tree is which, and which tree is him. Why would he want that? Thomas gave you a look that suggested you'd asked something both obvious and slightly foolish. Because it's the one night of the year he gets to be a stranger. Think about it. Every other night of his life, every single person in every room he walks into knows exactly who he is and adjust everything about themselves accordingly. How they stand, how they talk, what they say and don't say. Tonight, if the costume holds, he can dance with anyone he likes, and she won't know she's dancing with the king until he decides to tell her, or doesn't. You thought about that for a while, turning it over. It seemed like an enormous amount of trouble and expense, and it is an enormous amount of trouble and expense. You've watched 2 full weeks of it firsthand, just so one man could pretend, for a few hours, to be nobody in particular. But then, you suppose, if you were somebody in particular every single hour of every single day of your life, with no door you could close and no crowd you could vanish into, you might pay almost any price for a few hours of being unknown. You've never once in your life wanted for anonymity. You have it constantly, invisibly, the way you have air. And it has never once occurred to you until this week that a man could be so surrounded by attention that he'd spend a fortune trying to escape it for a single night. You've watched the rest of the palace bend itself around that single idea for 2 solid weeks now, in ways both enormous and small. Carpenters have spent days building the scaffold rigging above the Hall of Mirrors, hauling timber up narrow service stairs never meant to carry loads that size, cursing steadily under their breath the whole way. Gardeners have brought in cart after cart of clipped yew from the nurseries at Trianon, real trees with real root balls wrapped in sacking, each one requiring 4 men to lift and set into its gilded tub without snapping a branch. You passed one such cart 3 days ago in the north courtyard, its load half covered in frost, the gardener's breath fogging thick in the cold morning air as they argued about whether a particular tree's crown had been clipped too asymmetrically to pass inspection by the master of the king's gardens. A man apparently feared in his own department nearly as much as Master Robinet is feared in yours. The kitchens, meanwhile, have been given their own impossible task, provisioning refreshment for a crowd nobody can accurately predict the size of, somewhere between 6,000 and, if the doors are thrown open to the town as they always are, considerably more. You heard from a scullery boy you know slightly, a stocky, perpetually harried child named Mark who works 2 buildings over, that the pastry kitchens alone have been baking without rest since Monday, ovens kept lit around the clock, sugar and flour arriving by the sackload from stores that were meant to last the household through March. You've seen, too, in the corridors near the Dauphin's new apartments, small clusters of unfamiliar faces. Spanish attendants who arrived with the young bride weeks ago and have not yet learned their way around a palace built to a completely different rhythm than whatever household they came from. One of them, a girl perhaps a year or 2 older than you, nearly walked straight into you outside the linen stores 2 days past, arms full of pressed shifts, muttering something rapid and apologetic in Spanish that you understood not one word of, though her tone needed no translation. You've noticed since how carefully the Spanish household keeps to itself in most of the palace's public rooms, how the 2 languages rarely mix even among the servants, how the new Dauphine herself, glimpsed occasionally crossing a courtyard, still moves through Versailles the way you imagine you'd move through an enormous house built entirely by strangers, for strangers, according to rules nobody thought to fully explain to you before you arrived. You've picked up enough of the background from Thomas and from the older journeyman's gossip over the past 2 weeks to understand roughly why this particular wedding matters enough to justify a party of this size. The Dauphin, the king's own son, the boy who will, God willing, be king himself one day after his father, lost his first wife barely a year into their own marriage, a Spanish infanta who died of a fever not long after giving birth to a daughter who didn't long survive her either. The whole court wore mourning for months, you're told. The Dauphin himself apparently inconsolable, in a way that surprised people who'd expected a match, arranged for reasons of state to produce nothing warmer than polite tolerance between 2 young strangers. Now, barely more than a year later, a second Spanish match has been arranged. A second infanta brought across half a continent to marry the same widowed prince, and the whole enormous machinery of the court has thrown itself into celebrating this second wedding with a size and a spectacle that Thomas, only half joking, suggested might be less about genuine joy and more about making very certain nobody has time to dwell too long on how quickly the first wife was replaced. The wedding itself happened 2 days ago, in the chapel, a smaller and more solemn affair than what's coming tonight. The Dauphin, the king's own son and heir, married by proxy, and then in person to a Spanish infanta, a girl of 19 named Maria Teresa Rafaela, who arrived at Versailles after a journey of weeks with an entire household of Spanish attendants trailing behind her like a second court grafted onto the first. You caught a glimpse of her once from a distance, crossing the marble court in a gown so heavily embroidered with silver thread that 2 women had to walk beside her just to manage the weight of the train. She looked, from where you were standing, faintly seasick and enormously tired, the way anyone might look after being sent alone across a continent to marry a stranger for reasons of state that had nothing to do with her own wishes. The wedding itself was for God, and for treaties. Tonight is for everyone else. Tonight is the party the whole court has been waiting for since the marriage contracts were signed months ago, and the palace has been transformed for it in ways you've watched happen piece by piece over 2 exhausting weeks. The Hall of Mirrors, the great gallery that runs along the garden side of the palace, 17 enormous arched windows facing 17 matching mirrored arches on the opposite wall. The whole space over 200 feet long and lit, on an ordinary evening by perhaps a few hundred candles reflected and multiplied into what looks like thousands by all that silvered glass, has been turned, for tonight, into an indoor forest. Small clipped yew trees in enormous gilded tubs line both sides of the gallery. Real trees, brought in from the gardens and the nurseries at enormous trouble, their branches trimmed into perfect geometric shapes. Between them, false trees of wire and painted canvas and real greenery fill out the effect, so that by the time you walk the length of the gallery you've lost count of how many are living and how many are built, exactly as the 8 men in matching costumes intend for you to lose count of which one of them is the king. Above all of it, above the real trees and the false ones and the mirrors and the marble and the eventual 6,000 guests, hang the chandeliers. Your chandeliers, or as close to yours as anything in this palace, belongs to a 15-year-old apprentice. You've spent 4 full days this week up in the rigging above the gallery ceiling, in the narrow crawl spaces and along the scaffold platforms built specially for tonight, checking every chain link, every pulley, every socket, exactly as Master Robinet ordered twice over, because your own hands did half the checking the first time, and you don't entirely trust your own hands not to have missed something. 8 new chandeliers, each one heavier than you and Thomas together could lift off the ground, each one strung with dozens of branches, each branch holding a fresh beeswax candle from the batch you spent last week dipping. When they're all lit, and they will all be lit, every single one tonight, the light in that gallery is meant to be so bright and so multiplied by all that mirrored glass that guests are told, quite seriously, to expect something like daylight indoors at midnight. Daylight indoors at midnight requires, as it turns out, an enormous quantity of fire suspended directly above several thousand flammable, tightly packed human beings, and someone has to manage that fire from close enough to reach it, which is where you come in. Your post tonight, assigned 2 days ago by Master Robinet himself, in a tone that made clear he considered it both an honour and a serious responsibility, which for a 15-year-old apprentice amounts to the same thing, is on the scaffold platform above the 3rd and 4th chandeliers from the chapel end of the gallery, roughly the middle of the great room, with a clear line along the narrow catwalk to reach either fixture within a few dozen steps. You'll carry a long brass snuffer with a curved hook on one end for trimming wicks that burn too tall and too smoky, a small bucket of sand in case of sparks, and a coil of spare wick in your coat pocket in case a candle needs replacing entirely partway through the night. You will be, for most of the party, invisible. That's the whole design of it. The scaffold sits above the cornice line, tucked behind carved and gilded moulding meant to hide the workings of the chandeliers from anyone looking up from the floor. 6,000 guests will dance and eat and gossip and flirt directly beneath you for hours, and if you do your job well, not one of them will ever know you were there at all. That suits you fine. You've never particularly wanted to be seen. You've wanted, mostly, to not burn the Hall of Mirrors down around the King of France, while he dances with strangers dressed as a tree, and tonight you'll get your chance to find out whether 3 years of training have prepared you for that or not. The afternoon before the doors open is the strangest kind of busy, not the frantic rush of the final hour, but a longer, more anxious stretch of last checks and last worries, everyone in the department moving with the particular tension of people who know they'll be blamed personally for anything that goes wrong tonight, however small. You spend part of it with Madame Isabeau, one of the wardrobe women attached to the menu plaisir, who has been overseeing the construction of the yew costumes for the king's private party, and who has, over the past 2 weeks, developed an odd habit of talking to you while she works, the way some people talk to themselves or to a cat. You suspect it's because you're low enough in the household's hierarchy that anything she says to you carries no risk of it reaching anyone who matters, and high enough in her estimation, apparently, to be worth talking to at all. Feel this, she says today, holding out a swatch of the false foliage. Dyed green silk cut into thousands of tiny individual leaf shapes, each one stitched by hand onto a canvas backing that will be built up over a wire frame into the shape of a clipped tree, roughly man height, with slits cut for the wearer's eyes hidden deep within the branches. Do you know how many hands it took to make 8 of these? You don't. 40. 40 seamstresses working 12 hours a day for 3 weeks. Do you know what happens to a girl's fingers after 3 weeks of nothing but this? She holds up her own hand, and you see what you've half noticed on other women in the wardrobe department without quite understanding it. Fingertips gone hard and yellow-white with callus. Small burn-like marks where the needle has driven too fast and caught the skin instead of the fabric, over and over, until the body stops registering it as pain and starts registering it simply as work. It's beautiful, you say, because it is, and because you don't know what else to say. It's beautiful because 40 women I could not name for you if my life depended on it ruined their hands for 3 weeks so that one man could pretend for one evening that nobody knows who he is. She says this without any particular bitterness, the way you might state a fact about the weather. That's most of what beauty is in this palace, if you look closely enough. Somebody's hands, ruined so somebody else can look effortless. You think about your own hands, about the pruned pale fingertips and the white burn crescents under your nails, and you understand for the first time with any real clarity that you are one more set of ruined hands in a building absolutely full of them, that the entire glittering machine of Versailles runs on exactly this arrangement, repeated in 1,000 different trades, somebody's labour made invisible so that somebody else's pleasure can look like magic. Madame Isabeau holds up the wireframe next, the skeleton beneath the leaves, and turns it slowly so you can see how the whole costume is meant to fit over a man's shoulders. A kind of cage, really, built wide enough at the base to disguise a man's natural width and height, tapering upward into a rough conical shape, with a narrow slit worked into the front, hidden behind 3 overlapping layers of silk leaves, through which the wearer can see just enough to walk without stumbling and not 1 degree more. He'll be half blind in it, she says, not unkindly, more as a simple statement of the engineering problem she's spent 2 weeks solving. All 8 of them will be. That's rather the point. If one tree could see clearly and the others couldn't, people would learn to watch for the one who moves with more confidence. So we've built them all exactly the same. Same slit width, same weight of frame, same restriction on the arms. She runs a hand along one of the wire ribs, checking a join with the automatic, unthinking precision of someone who has checked several hundred identical joins already this week. Do you know how many times I've had to remake this one particular seam because a King's Guard officer insisted his own tree costume was heavier than the others, and someone would notice the difference in how he carried himself? You don't, and say so. 4 times. 4 times I've unpicked and rebuilt the exact same seam, because a grown man with a sword at his hip was more afraid of being mistaken for slightly less important than his companions than he was of the seamstress who'd already spent 11 hours that day with a needle in her hand. She says this, again, without any real anger in her voice, simply setting the frame back down among its 7 identical companions, lined up along the wall like a small green regiment waiting for its orders. You'll learn this if you stay in service long enough, for The people at the very top of this palace worry about the smallest things imaginable, because they've never once in their lives had to worry about the large ones. No one at this court has ever gone hungry wondering whether tomorrow's flower will arrive. So instead they worry whether their tree looks precisely as tall as the tree beside it. You think later, climbing the ladder back up toward your own post above the gallery, that you'll probably never forget that particular observation, delivered so plainly over a wire frame built to disguise a king. It's not a comfortable thought, but it doesn't make you angry either. Not exactly. Mostly it makes you feel like you understand something about the building you work in that you didn't understand 3 years ago, something Master Robinet and Madame Isabeau and probably every other adult in the Menu Plaisir learned a long time before you did and simply stopped mentioning, because there was no use in mentioning it, because the work still had to be done regardless. Old Antoine, one of the ushers who's worked the great state occasions at Versailles for longer than anyone can quite remember, finds you an hour later checking the last of your wick coils in the candle stores, and settles himself on an overturned crate with the particular satisfaction of an old man who has a story he intends to tell whether or not you want to hear it. First big one for you, is it? Up in the rigging? Yes. I was up there myself once, younger than you. Chandelier work, before I moved to doors. He rubs one knee, an old habit you've noticed he does whenever the subject turns to his younger years, as though the knee remembers something the rest of him would rather forget. Fell once myself, not far, maybe 8 feet, off a lower platform onto a stack of folded linen that happened to be sitting exactly where I landed, which is the only reason I'm sitting here telling you about it instead of somebody else telling a very different story about me. Knee's never been right since. Tells me when it's going to rain a full day before the clouds do. You know what nearly happened at the last big masquerade before this one? Years back, this must be. The Dauphin's first wife's wedding celebrations. The Spanish one before this Spanish one, God rest her poor soul. You don't know, and say so. Crowd got in that wasn't meant to. That's the thing nobody plans for properly. You plan the guest list, you plan the seating, you plan the whole beautiful evening down to which fork goes where. And then the doors open, and half of Paris that heard there was masquerade at Versailles simply walks in off the road. Because for one night, by the king's own tradition, anyone respectably dressed can come and watch. Anyone. No invitation required, not for a masquerade, not since the old king's time. So you get your 6,000 invited guests, and then you get however many thousand more just wandering through the garden gates because they heard the music and wanted to see the spectacle for themselves. Nobody counts them. Nobody can count them. And all of a sudden a room built and lit and staffed for 6,000 has got 8, 9, who knows how many thousand crammed into it, and there isn't a door in this palace built wide enough to let that many people out quickly if something goes wrong. Did something go wrong? Not that time. Heat mostly. People fainting from the crush and the candle smoke and no air moving anywhere in a sealed room in February with every window shut against the cold. Women carried out half-conscious, corsets cut open right there on the marble because there was no time to be delicate about it. But no fire that time. We were lucky that time. He gives you a long look, the kind of look that's meant to land somewhere and stay there. Tonight's going to be bigger. Everyone's saying so. The king himself wants the doors open to the town, same as always, because he likes being seen by his people even when, especially when, they don't know it's him they're seeing. So you'll have your 6,000 invited, and God knows how many more from Paris and Versailles town both, and every one of them wanting a look at the yew trees before the night's out. You mind what I've told you. You watch that heat as close as you watch the flame. Heat's the one that sneaks up on you. You will in fact remember exactly what he told you in about 6 hours' time, when it matters more than you can possibly imagine right now. Sitting on an overturned crate in a room that still smells like cooling wax, half listening to an old man's story, the way you half listen to most old men's stories, filing it away without knowing yet which parts of it you'll need. Before that, though, there's a meal to eat. Because Master Robinet was right about one thing above all others tonight. Nobody works well on an empty stomach, least of all a boy about to spend 9 hours on a scaffold above a room full of open flame. The servants' hall where the lower household eats is already crowded when you and Thomas make your way there an hour before the doors open. Benches packed shoulder to shoulder with footmen and scullery girls and grooms and laundresses, all of them either coming off a long day's preparation or bracing themselves for a long night's work still ahead. The whole room loud with the particular clatter and steam of a kitchen, trying to feed several hundred people at once in under an hour. You eat quickly, the way you always eat here. A thick barley soup with a heel of bread, a strip of salted pork you're fairly sure has been in the larder longer than is entirely wise, all of it washed down with small beer that tastes faintly of the cask it's been stored in. Outside the hall's high, narrow windows the February evening has gone properly dark and properly cold, the kind of cold that finds every gap in a coat and every crack around a door, and you're grateful, not for the first time this winter, that your work at least keeps you near warmth even when the rest of the palace's lower servants shiver through their duties in unheated corridors and courtyards. Thomas eats across from you, unusually quiet for once, and you understand, watching him, that even his easy Parisian confidence has thinned a little under the weight of what's coming tonight. Neither of you says much. There isn't much to say that the two of you don't already understand without saying it, that tonight is larger than anything either of you has worked before, that Master Robinier's warnings carried more weight than his usual instructions, that somewhere between the soup growing cold in your bowl and the doors opening in an hour, the easy, ordinary rhythm of your working life is about to give way to something neither of you has quite the experience to predict. By 7 in the evening, the last of the daylight has long since failed outside the tall windows, and the hall of mirrors stands finished and waiting, and it is, even to your tired and wax-stained eyes, one of the most extraordinary things you've ever seen. You're up on the scaffold by then, settled into your post above the third chandelier, close enough to reach out and touch the topmost branch if you leaned across the rail, which you're under strict instructions never to do without holding onto the safety rope with your other hand. From up here, before the doors open and the crowd floods in, you can look the full length of the gallery and see the whole design of the evening laid out below you, like something built for giants to admire from above. The false forest fills the length of the room, real yew trees and painted false ones arranged in ranks along both walls, their dark clipped green made stranger and more beautiful by the candlelight already burning in every sconce along the mirrored piers. Between the trees, small tables have been set with refreshments, sugared fruits, iced creams, wine in crystal that catches and scatters the light into 1,000 smaller points, as though the room hasn't got enough light already. And above it all, your 8 chandeliers, each one fully dressed now with its full complement of fresh white candles, unlit yet, waiting. Master Robinet climbs the scaffold ladder himself at 7:30 to make one final inspection, moving along the narrow platform with the unhurried, deliberate care of a man who's been doing exactly this for 40 years and intends to keep doing it exactly the same way for as many more as his body allows. Wicks trimmed? Yes, sir. Sandbucket full? Yes, sir. Rope secured. You show him, and he checks it himself anyway, tugging hard on the knot, which doesn't offend you. You'd rather he check it twice than trust it once and be wrong. Good. He straightens, and for a moment standing there above the empty gallery in the last quiet minutes before 6,000 people flood into it, he looks almost like he might say something more than instructions. You'll be up here a long time tonight for 8, 9 hours, maybe more if His Majesty is enjoying himself, and he generally does at these things. Eat something now if you haven't. Drink water even if you're not thirsty. That heat down there is going to climb faster than you expect once the room fills, and it'll climb faster still once we light every candle in every branch. If you feel your head go strange, dizzy, thick, like you're hearing everything from underwater, you signal Thomas over there. He nods toward the far scaffold platform, a shadow you can just make out across the gallery's width, and you come down. No shame in it. A boy who faints on the scaffold and falls 40 feet does the king a great deal less good than a boy who climbs down for 10 minutes and comes back steady. Understood? Understood. He studies you a moment longer, and something in his weathered, scarred face softens very slightly. The closest thing to warmth you've seen from him in 3 years of working under him. You've got good hands, Fair. Careful ones. That's rarer than you'd think in boys your age, and it's the only thing that matters up here. Mind the heat, mind the flame, and you'll do fine. It is, you realise later, the nearest thing to real praise Master Robini has ever given anyone, and you'll carry it with you for a long time after tonight, long after the wax has finally worked its way out from under your fingernails for good. At 8 o'clock, word comes up through the ranks, a runner boy climbing the scaffold ladder just long enough to relay it before scrambling back down, that the doors are opening. Master Robinet gives the signal, and all along the gallery boys like you and Thomas move to their posts with tapers of their own, touching flame to wick, branch by branch, chandelier by chandelier, until the whole enormous room begins to fill with light the way a bowl fills with water, slowly at first, and then, as the last of the 8 great fixtures catches fully alight, all at once. You have never seen anything like it, not in 3 years of working in this palace, not in your whole life before that. The candlelight catches in the mirrors and multiplies, catches in the crystal glasses and the silver and the gilded frames and multiplies again, until the entire gallery seems to be built out of light itself, warm and golden and almost too bright to look at directly, the way you're not meant to look directly at the sun. 200 feet of mirrored gallery blazing, and you are 30 feet above it, close enough to feel the heat already rising off 8 fully lit chandeliers before a single guest has even walked through the door. Then the doors open, and the guests begin to come in, and the evening you've spent 2 weeks preparing for finally properly begins. It comes in waves at first. The most important guests, the ones with formal precedence, the ones who arrive in the king's own carriages or close behind them, enter first through the state apartments, moving in a slow, magnificent procession that you can track from above by the particular quality of their costumes, silk and velvet and real jewels, catching the chandelier light in ways the later, less wealthy arrivals won't quite manage. You watch shepherdesses in gowns that cost more than your father earns in a decade. Watch a man dressed as a Turkish pasha with a turban studded with what you sincerely hope, for his own sake, are paste jewels and not real ones. Watch a cluster of women dressed identically as the 9 muses, laughing together as they find their places along the gallery wall. More follow behind them, a slow glittering procession that seems from above to have no end. A domino cloak in scarlet silk lined with black, worn by a figure who moves through the crowd with the particular unhurried confidence of someone very used to being watched. A woman got up as a milkmaid in a gown so heavily embroidered with pearls that the effect achieves the exact opposite of rustic simplicity it presumably intended. A whole cluster of men dressed as characters from the old Italian comedy, their masks long-nosed and grinning, chasing each other in mock pursuit through the thickening crowd to general laughter. A Chinese mandarin in silk robes dyed a blue so deep it looks black, except where the chandelier light catches its folds directly. Somewhere among them, briefly, you spot a figure dressed entirely as a personification of winter. Robes of white and silver, a headdress worked with what might be real icicles of cut glass, moving alone through the crowd with a stillness that stands out precisely because everyone around them is in motion. You'll learn weeks later, piecing it together from servants' gossip the way you piece together most things you learn about the court's private business, that the Dauphine herself watched much of the early evening from a private vantage rather than joining the crush directly, that the Queen kept mostly to her own small circle near one end of the gallery, exchanging quiet words with a handful of older, trusted courtiers, rather than losing herself in the dancing the way the younger guests do, and that at least one foreign ambassador spent the better part of an hour attempting, without success, to identify which of the 8 green trees was worth cultivating as a diplomatic acquaintance before giving up and simply enjoying the wine instead. And then, perhaps 20 minutes in, you see them. 8 identical figures moving together through the crowd near the chapel end of the gallery, clipped and green from head to foot, faceless behind their canvas and silk foliage, indistinguishable from one another in every way that matters. The king's party. Somewhere among those 8 men, one of them is the most powerful person in France, and not one soul on the gallery floor, perhaps not even Master Robinet himself, watching from his own post near the centre of the room, could tell you which one. It is, you think, watching them move together in a loose, deliberate cluster, exactly the effect they were built for. Even from 30 feet up, with a clearer view of the whole gallery than almost anyone below could claim, you find your eyes sliding from one green figure to the next, trying and failing to fix on any single one of them as more important than the rest. The crowd thickens through the next hour in a way that starts, gradually, to worry you, the way old Antoine's story worried at the back of your mind all afternoon. The invited guests fill the gallery to what looks, from above, like a very full but still manageable capacity. Enough bodies that the trees between the tables start to disappear from view, but still enough clear space that people can move, can dance in the cleared areas near the centre, can find their way to the refreshment tables without shoving. Then the town starts arriving. You don't see it happen so much as you feel it happen, the way you might feel a tide coming in without watching each individual wave. From your post above, you can just make out through the tall windows facing the garden side of the gallery the distant flare of torchlight strung all the way along the approach road from the town of Versailles itself, a river of small moving lights growing thicker by the minute, hundreds, and then what looks like thousands of ordinary people walking the frozen road up from the town in their best clothes, wrapped against the cold drawn by word that has apparently travelled through every tavern and market stall in the district within hours of the first invitations going out. Old Antoine's story comes back to you almost word for word. Watching that line of torches lengthen in the dark, anyone respectably dressed can come and watch. Anyone. No invitation required. The crowd along the walls thickens further as they arrive, filtering in through the garden entrances in a steady stream that the ushers, old Antoine somewhere among them, you assume, doing exactly the job he described this afternoon, can only really manage rather than actually control, checking coats and shoes for the bare minimum standard of respectability and waving through anyone who clears that low bar. Because there is, as Antoine told you, no mechanism at all for turning away a crowd that royal custom itself has invited. You watch families come through together, watch a cluster of young clerks in borrowed finery pointing up at the chandeliers and the mirrors with open, unguarded wonder on their faces. Watch an older couple move slowly along the edge of the gallery with the particular careful, reverent tread of people walking through a church rather than a ballroom. The clear dancing space at the centre of the gallery shrinks with every fresh wave. Guests pressed closer together than seems comfortable, closer than seems safe. New arrivals keep coming through the far doors in a steady stream that shows no sign of thinning. Ordinary Parisians and Versailles townsfolk in their good clothes, standing shoulder to shoulder now with duchesses and foreign ambassadors, the whole rigid architecture of court precedents dissolving for one night into a single undifferentiated crush of bodies all pressed toward the same warm, bright, candle-lit centre, taking full advantage of a custom that nobody in the crowd below appears inclined to police. By 10 o'clock, the gallery that was built and lit and staffed for perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 people holds, by your own rough count made from above, counting clusters and multiplying, the only kind of counting anyone could manage in a crowd this size. Something closer to double that number, and still they keep coming. You can see from this height the way the dancing itself has changed shape as the crowd has thickened. No longer the wide, formal patterns you watched earlier in the evening. Couples turning and crossing in orderly lines the length of the cleared central space, but something looser now, more crowded. Dancers packed close enough together that entire figures of the dance collapse into something closer to swaying. Arms raised overhead where there's no longer room to extend them properly. Masks slipping sideways with the heat and the movement, ribbons and powdered curls coming loose from careful arrangements that took some lady's maid the better part of an afternoon to build. You watch one woman's elaborate headdress, feathers dyed a brilliant unnatural blue, wired upright in a great sweeping fan, finally give up entirely under the crush, toppling sideways into the crowd, and she laughs, from what you can tell at this distance, rather than minding, snatching it back up off the floor before anyone can trample it, and clutching it to her chest instead, one hand pressed flat against loosened, sweat-damp curls. You watch the first of the fainting happen a little after that, and you understand, seeing it, exactly what old Antoine meant this afternoon about corsets cut open right there on the marble. A woman near the base of the third chandelier. You can see her clearly from your post. A shepherdess costume gone limp with sweat. Her mask pushed up onto her forehead, sways once, twice, and then simply folds straight down, the crowd around her too dense for her to fall properly to the floor, so that for a long, strange moment she seems almost to hang there, held upright by the sheer press of bodies, before the people nearest her realize what's happening and begin, with visible effort, to force a small, clear space around her. Two men lift her between them, passing her hand over hand toward the edge of the room, the way you might pass a piece of furniture too awkward for one person to carry through a crowded doorway, her head lolling, her slippered feet dragging uselessly against the marble until someone thinks to gather them up as well. You lose sight of her once they reach the wall, but you don't lose sight over the following hour of at least 4 more incidents very much like it. A man in a Turkish costume half carried out by 2 footmen, his turban abandoned on the floor and trampled within minutes. An older woman fanning herself so violently that her fan itself finally splits down the spine. Useless. Discarded. A young man who simply sits down, hard, in the middle of the dancing floor, too dazed by heat and drink and crush to stand back up on his own, until a passing pair of masked guests haul him upright between them and half walk, half drag him toward whatever fresher air might exist near the doors. None of it stops the party. That's the thing that strikes you most watching from above. The crowd simply flows around each small emergency the way a river flows around a stone, closing back over the space within moments, the music never once faltering, the dancing near the centre never once fully pausing. Whatever is happening at the edges of the room, wherever bodies are being carried out through whatever door will have them, the great glittering centre of the evening rolls on entirely undisturbed, because from the floor, in a crowd this size, you can only ever see the small patch of it immediately around you, and the small patch immediately around most of these 10, 12, perhaps closer to 13,000 people by now. Guests is still bright and loud and full of wine and dancing and the particular electric thrill of not knowing, until midnight, which tree among the 8 is the king. The heat by now has become something you can almost see, a faint shimmer in the air above the massed crowd, thickened further by the smoke of 13,000 candles all burning at once, so many wicks trailing so much fine grey smoke into the gallery's high ceiling that a soft haze has begun collecting up near the cornice line, close enough to your own platform that you can taste it at the back of your throat with every breath. A dry, waxy, faintly acrid taste that makes your eyes water, even when you're not looking directly at any single flame. Sound reaches you differently from 30 feet up too, in a way nobody warned you about during 2 weeks of checking chains and testing ropes in an empty room. On the floor you imagine the party must sound like 100 separate conversations, 100 separate flirtations and negotiations and small dramas, each one distinct to the people living inside it. From above, all of it blends into a single continuous roar. A wall of sound with the orchestra's music somewhere buried inside it, occasionally surfacing in a recognizable phrase, before being swallowed again by the crowd's noise. The whole thing pierced every so often by a burst of laughter, sharp enough to carry all the way up to your platform, or a single raised voice arguing about something you'll never learn the subject of, or the high, delighted shriek of someone being startled by a friend in an unfamiliar costume. Fragments drift up to you sometimes, caught for just a moment before the roar closes back over them. A woman's voice, directly below the scaffold at one point, saying something about how she'd wager real money that the tallest of the 8 trees is the Duke of Chartres, because no ordinary man walks with his shoulders set quite that way. A man's voice, a little further off, complaining that his mask has rubbed his ear raw, and he intends to unmask the moment the king does, regardless of what anyone thinks proper. 2 voices, layered together, arguing in the particular hushed, urgent tone of people discussing money, something about a debt and a promissory note, and a cousin who ought to have paid it by Michaelmas. You catch these fragments the way you might catch snow on your sleeve, whole and perfect for a single second before they melt back into the general noise and vanish. Thousands of small private lives passing directly beneath your feet, each one entirely unaware that a 15-year-old boy with a snuffer in his hand is listening from above. The light itself, this deep into the evening, has taken on a quality you don't have good words for. though you'll try to describe it to Georges years later more than once. It isn't simply bright. It's bright in a way that seems to have weight to it, seems to press against your eyes after enough hours of exposure. 17 mirrored arches multiplying 8 full chandeliers and hundreds of wall sconces into something that looks, from this height, less like a room and more like the inside of some enormous jewel, every surface throwing light back at every other surface until there's no longer any clear source for any of it, just light itself, everywhere, endless, and underneath all that light, the heat that comes with it, rising, the way old Antoine warned you it would. The heat reaches you before you fully understand why. It builds slowly, the way old Antoine warned it would. Not a single moment where the room goes from cool to hot, but a long creeping climb that you register first as a faint dampness at your collar, then as sweat actually running down your back beneath your shirt, then as a heaviness in the air itself, thick and close, smelling of 8,000 burning candles and 6,000, no, more than 6,000, closer to 12 or 13,000 now, by your best guess, human bodies packed into a sealed room in the middle of winter with every window shut tight against the February cold outside. You understand, watching it happen, exactly what old Antoine meant about heat sneaking up on you. Down on the gallery floor you can see women fanning themselves with increasing urgency, see men loosening their collars, see the general easy movement of the crowd from an hour ago giving way to something slower and more laboured. People picking their way between bodies rather than walking freely. The whole enormous room compressing minute by minute into something closer to a crush than a party. Your job right now is candles, watching the branches nearest you for wicks burning too tall and smoky, trimming them with the long-handled snuffer before they can drip too much wax onto the guests below, checking each socket for wax pooling dangerously close to the edge, replacing any candle that's burned low enough to risk guttering out entirely and leaving a gap in the light that someone important might notice. It's careful, repetitive, exacting work, made harder by the growing heat and by the sway of the scaffold platform itself, which was never built to hold entirely still under the weight of a boy leaning out to reach a far branch, and which creaks faintly every time you shift your weight, a sound that used to worry you 3 days ago during the checks, and now simply exists as part of the working night. Background noise beneath the music and the roar of thousands of voices rising up from the floor. Somewhere below and to your left, an orchestra you can't quite see is playing something bright and fast, and the crowd nearest the cleared central space is dancing, or attempting to, in a crush that leaves little room for anything more than a kind of collective swaying. You catch glimpses, between the trees and the moving bodies, of the 8 green figures still moving as a loose cluster near the centre of the room, and once, briefly, you think you see one of them break away from the others, drawn off by a woman in a huntress costume. Bow and quiver, a crescent moon set into her headdress. The kind of costume a girl chooses when she wants to be noticed, even in a room built for 6,000 people, all trying to be noticed at once. You don't think much of it at the time. You have candles to watch, and the heat is climbing, and somewhere in the back of your mind old Antoine's voice keeps repeating itself. Watch the heat as close as you watch the flame. Around 11, your own head does the thing Master Robinet warned you about. A slow, thick, swimming sensation that starts behind your eyes and spreads outward. The sound of the crowd below going strange and muffled, as though you're hearing it through several layers of wet cloth. You grip the rail hard, force yourself to breathe slowly, the way your body has learned to do around the vats on the worst days of summer work, and you signal across the gallery's width to Thomas, exactly as instructed, one hand raised, palm out, the agreed signal for, "I need to come down for a few minutes." He signals back, watch confirmed, and you make your careful way along the catwalk to the small service stair tucked behind the cornice moulding. Climbing down into a narrow, cooler passage that runs behind the gallery's outer wall, built specifically, you realise only now, for exactly this purpose. A place for the scaffold crew to recover for a few minutes without abandoning their posts entirely. The air back here is blessedly cooler, and you sit on the floor with your back against the stone, head between your knees, until the swimming feeling passes and the noise of the party beyond the wall settles back into something ordinary and distinguishable, rather than one solid wall of sound. It takes perhaps 10 minutes. You drink the last of your water flask, splash a little of what remains onto your wrists and the back of your neck, and climb back up to your post feeling steadier, though not entirely steady. The heat down on the gallery floor clearly still climbing even in the short time you were away. You'll think of this later, several times, as the reason your body was already primed to move fast when the ivy appeared, as though the 10 minutes spent recovering in the cool service passage had, without your quite realising it, sharpened rather than dulled your attention to exactly how much danger was building in the room around you. It's past 11 when you first notice the drapery. The gallery has been hung for tonight with long swags of green silk and real ivy trained along the cornice line to complete the forest effect from below. Decoration meant to be admired from the floor and never meant by anyone's careful planning to come anywhere near the open flame of the chandeliers 30 feet above. But the crowd has been growing and growing, and somewhere in the last hour, as more and more bodies press toward the centre of the room, seeking whatever thin currents of cooler air might still exist, the crush along the walls has shifted people and furniture both, and one long swag of decorative ivy, real ivy, dried out now after 2 weeks pinned against warm plaster, brittle and ready to catch, has come loose from its fixing point and is hanging lower than it should, swaying gently in the rising heat, close enough to the fourth chandelier's outermost branch that you feel your whole body go cold despite the sweltering air the moment you spot it. Not touching, not yet, but close and swinging very slightly with every surge of the crowd below, and getting closer with each pass. You don't remember deciding to move. Your body simply moves, the way it's been trained to move for 3 years, faster than thought, out along the narrow catwalk toward the fourth chandelier's platform, one hand locked on the safety rope, the other already reaching for the long snuffer hooked to your belt. Your heart slamming so hard against your ribs that you can feel it in your throat. The distance from your post to the fourth chandelier is perhaps 30 feet of narrow scaffold plank. 30 feet you've walked a dozen times today in the quiet hours before the doors opened, and it has never once felt as long as it feels now, with the platform swaying under the shifting weight of the crowd's noise and heat, rising up around you like something with a physical, pressing weight, and the ivy swinging closer to the flame with every second you're not yet there. You reach the platform with perhaps 10 feet still separating the drooping ivy from the nearest candle flame, and you have exactly enough time to think, with a clarity that surprises you even as it happens, that 10 feet is not very much distance at all when something is swinging, before you're already working, reaching out with the hooked end of the snuffer, catching the trailing edge of the ivy swag, drawing it back and up and away from the chandelier's reach, your arms shaking with the effort of holding the awkward weight steady against the rope's limited slack, sweat running freely down your face now, stinging your eyes, your shirt soaked through beneath your coat. It takes both hands in the end, one on the rope and one dragging the snuffer's hook through the tangle of leaves, until you can pin the loose end against the platform's low rail with your own knee, freeing one hand just long enough to fumble a length of spare wick cord from your coat pocket and lash the ivy fast to the rail itself. 3 tight loops, a knot you've tied 100 times on candle racks and have never once tied with your hands shaking this badly. It holds. You test it hard with your whole weight pulling against it, and it holds. For a moment you simply crouch there on the swaying platform, 30 feet above the most important party of the decade, shaking. Your palms raw where the snuffer's handle bit into them, and you understand, with a kind of delayed and overwhelming force, exactly what almost happened, and exactly how close it came to happening, in a room holding perhaps 13,000 people, with a handful of doors between them and open air. Your whole body registers it before your mind fully catches up. A cold sweat breaking out across your back even as the surrounding air stays thick and hot. Your knees gone watery and unreliable beneath you. Your breath coming too fast and too shallow. The particular sick lightness in your stomach that comes after danger rather than during it. When the body finally has a moment to understand what it just survived. You felt fear before, working around open flame for 3 years. The ordinary, useful fear that keeps your hands careful. But you've never felt it quite like this, arriving all at once in a single flood, rather than sitting quietly in the background of your work the way it usually does. You make yourself look, one more time, at the length of ivy lashed to the rail, tracing with your eyes the exact path it would have swung had you been 30 seconds slower reaching it, down, across, into the outermost candle on the 4th chandelier's lowest branch, catching first at the very tips of the dried leaves, the way dry ivy catches, fast and almost silent at first, a small orange bloom no larger than a coin, and then, within moments, climbing the rest of the vine toward the swag's main body, toward the silk hangings pinned along the whole length of that wall, toward trees, real trees, dried at their clipped edges after 2 weeks indoors, arranged in ranks the entire length of the gallery. You don't let yourself finish the thought properly. You don't need to. Your body has already done the arithmetic for you, in the cold sweat and the shaking hands and the sick, hollow feeling behind your ribs. Nobody below noticed. That's the strangest part of it. The part you'll turn over in your mind for weeks afterward. 30 feet beneath you, the party continued exactly as it had continued for the last 3 hours. Dancing, laughing, the orchestra playing, the 8 green figures still moving through the crowd, one of them still, as far as you can tell from up here, deep in conversation with the huntress in her crescent moon headdress. Not one person on that crowded, sweltering floor knows how close they came in the last 2 or 3 minutes to finding out exactly how fast dried ivy and old silk hangings burn when set alight 30 feet above a room with no way for 13,000 people to leave it quickly. Thomas reaches you a minute later, having seen you moving fast along the catwalk from his own post, and guessed correctly that something had gone wrong. He takes one look at the lashed-down ivy, at your shaking hands, at your face, and doesn't say anything at first, just checks you're not himself, the way Master Robinet checked your rope earlier tonight, and nods once it holds under his own hard pull. Close is all he says eventually, quiet enough that it doesn't carry past the 2 of you. Yes. Robinet needs to know, not to blame you, to get someone to check every other swag along this whole wall before it happens again somewhere else. You nod, because he's right, and because you're not sure your own voice would hold steady enough right now to explain it properly to Master Robinet yourself. Thomas makes the trip along the catwalk to fetch him, and you're left alone for a few minutes on the platform, hands still shaking, watching the party continue below, with an entirely new understanding of how thin the membrane really is between a beautiful evening and a catastrophe. How little separates 6,000 candles burning safely in their sockets from 6,000 candles burning something they were never meant to touch. Master Robinet arrives within minutes, moving along the scaffold with the same unhurried care as always, though you notice once he reaches you that his breathing is faster than his walk would suggest, the pace of a man who moved quickly the moment he understood what Thomas was telling him, and only slowed himself down once he reached sight of the platform, so as not to alarm anyone below by hurrying visibly above their heads. He checks the knot. He checks the distance from the nearest flame. He checks your hands, turning them over in his own scarred ones without asking permission, noting the raw places where the snuffer's handle tore your palm, and something moves across his face that you don't have a name for yet. Not quite fear, not quite relief, something that lives in the space between the two. You caught it in time. Yes, sir. How much time? You tell him as close as you can estimate. 10 feet of swing space, closing fast, maybe 2 minutes before contact, if that. He's quiet for a moment, doing some calculation of his own behind his still weathered face, and you understand, watching him do it, that he's thinking through exactly the same thing you thought through on the platform a few minutes ago. 13,000 people, a handful of doors, dried ivy catching 30 feet above their heads before a single one of them noticed the smell of smoke over the smell of 8,000 candles already burning. You've heard him described by older journeymen who've worked under him for decades as a man who does not frighten easily, who has walked calmly through smaller fires in his time without his pulse ever visibly changing, and you understand now, watching the particular careful stillness in his face as he works through what nearly happened, that this description has always been at least partly wrong, or rather, that the calm itself is not the absence of fear, but the discipline built over 40 years to keep fear from showing on the outside, which strikes you in this exhausted, overheated moment as a far more useful and far harder thing to master than simply not being afraid at all. Good work for... He says it simply, without ceremony, but you understand from the particular stillness in his voice that it means something larger than the two words themselves carry. I'll have every swag on this wall checked and refixed within the hour, and I'll be having words with whoever pinned that ivy up in the first place, badly enough that a full house of dancing bodies could shake it loose. You did exactly what you were trained to do, and you did it fast enough that it mattered. That's all any of us can ask of ourselves up here. He doesn't send you down, though you half expect him to, given how badly your hands are shaking even now. Instead, he simply says, 10 minutes. Sit, drink some water, let your hands settle, then back to your post. I need eyes on that fourth chandelier the rest of the night, given what it very nearly did to us. You take the 10 minutes. You sit on the platform's low rail with your back against the gilded moulding, drinking water from the flask Thomas fetches for you, watching your own hands slowly stop shaking in your lap, and you think, with a strange and sudden clarity, about old Antoine's story from this afternoon, about the crowd that flooded in uninvited years ago, and the women carried out half-conscious with their corsets cut open, about how these things happen not because anyone is careless exactly, but because a beautiful evening and a catastrophe are built from exactly the same materials: fire, crowds, heat, silk, arranged in exactly the same room, separated only by a margin of luck and attention so thin that a 15-year-old boy with raw palms and a length of spare whipcord turned out to be most of what stood between 6,000, no, 13,000 people, and a very different kind of story than the one they'll tell tomorrow. The party does not stop. That's the other strange thing you notice once your hands have steadied enough to go back to work. 30 feet below you, entirely unaware of what almost happened directly above their heads, the guests continue exactly as before, dancing, drinking, gossiping behind their masks. The 8 green figures still moving through the crowd near the centre of the room, the orchestra still playing, the whole magnificent machine of the evening rolling forward without the smallest visible interruption, because nobody down there ever knew there was anything to interrupt it with. It's nearly midnight when the moment everyone has apparently been waiting for finally happens, and you have, by pure accident of position, one of the better views of it in the entire gallery. You've noticed over the last hour a kind of gravitational pull building around one particular corner of the room, near where the dancing has cleared the widest space. A shifting current in the crowd, people angling themselves to watch without seeming to watch, the way a crowd does when it senses something is about to happen and doesn't want to miss it. At the centre of that current, as far as you can tell from above, are 2 figures, one of the 8 identical green trees, and the huntress in her crescent moon headdress, who has apparently spent a good part of the last several hours in his company, moving together through the crowd, dancing together when the crush allowed for dancing, drawing exactly the kind of attention that 8 identical costumes were specifically designed to prevent. And then, near midnight, in a moment that seems to ripple outward through the crowd almost before it fully happens, a kind of collective intake of breath you can somehow sense even from 30 feet up, over the music and the roar of thousands of conversations. The green figure reaches up with both hands and lifts away the canvas and silk foliage that has hidden his face all evening. You can't see his features clearly from this height and this distance, not well enough to have recognized him yourself if you didn't already know, from the way the crowd around him seems to fold inward, exactly who he must be. But you don't need to see his face clearly to understand what's happening below you. The King of France, revealed at last, in the middle of his own masquerade, standing face to face with a young woman in a huntress's costume who is, judging by the way she doesn't step back, by the way, the small cluster of courtiers nearest them go suddenly, carefully still, exactly the person he intended to be revealed to. You don't know her name. Nobody up on the scaffold does, not yet. Though by the time you climb down at dawn, Thomas will have already heard 3 different versions of it whispered among the footmen near the refreshment tables, and within a week the whole palace, upstairs and down, servant and courtier alike, will know it perfectly well. Jeanne Antoinette, wife of a tax official named Le Normand d'Etioles, a Parisian woman of remarkable beauty, and, by every account that reaches you afterward, remarkable wit as well, who came to a masquerade dressed as the goddess of the hunt and left it, by the time the story finishes, travelling through the servants' halls over the following weeks, having caught something considerably larger than any deer. Word passes up through the ranks fast. The way important news always seems to travel fastest through exactly the people it concerns least directly. Within perhaps 20 minutes, a footman climbs partway up the service stair behind the cornice to relay the story to Thomas, who relays it to you in turn, leaning across the gap between your two platforms and pitching his voice low enough to carry over the music without being heard from below. The king had apparently spent much of the evening quietly manoeuvring his way toward the huntress, rather than the reverse, that several of his own gentlemen had known for weeks who she was and had helped arrange discreetly for her own costume and mask to be memorable enough that he could find her again in a crowd of 13,000 people, all wearing masks of their own. It strikes you, hearing this, that even the accident of the evening, the not knowing, the 8 identical trees, the whole elaborate theatre of anonymity, had itself been quietly stage-managed from within, at least on his side of it, in ways that make you wonder how much of anything that happens in this palace is ever really left to chance. You don't know, watching from 30 feet up with your hands still faintly trembling from the ivy an hour before, that you're watching the beginning of something that will reshape the entire court around you for the next 20 years. A new mistress, a new centre of gravity, new fortunes made and old ones lost, a woman who will eventually take the title Madame de Pompadour and become one of the most powerful people in France without ever holding a single official position that would explain why. You only know in this moment that you're watching something the crowd below considers extraordinary, and that you have, through no plan of your own, one of the best seats in the entire palace for it. Word of a supper being laid reaches you sometime past midnight, carried up the scaffold ladder by a runner boy the way the signal to light the chandeliers reached you hours before, and from your platform you watch it happen below in stages. Long tables assembled and dressed at the far end of the gallery near the Peace Salon, an army of footmen carrying out dish after dish under silver domes, the crowd nearest that end of the room reorganizing itself around the promise of food the way any crowd anywhere reorganizes itself around the promise of food, royal or otherwise. You can't see the food itself clearly from this height, but you can see the choreography of it, the practiced wordless coordination of servants who have laid out formal suppers for royalty so many times that the whole operation moves like a single machine with dozens of separate hands. You think, watching it, of your own supper hours ago in the crowded servants' hall, the thick barley soup, the questionable salted pork, the small beer that tasted of its cask, and you understand, with the particular clarity that comes from standing 30 feet above both worlds at once, that you and the guests below are, tonight, eating from the very same building, prepared in kitchens not 200 paces apart from each other, and that the distance between a bowl of barley soup and whatever sits under those silver domes has nothing at all to do with the walls of the palace, and everything to do with which side of a service door you happen to have been born on. The rest of the night, once the king is unmasked, takes on a different quality. Looser somehow, the strange tension of not knowing dissolved now that everyone knows exactly who has been dancing among them all evening. The other 7 green figures unmask soon after, one by one, revealing themselves as various great nobles of the court, and the crowd's attention scatters back out across the whole gallery, rather than orbiting that one corner, and the party, if anything, grows louder and freer for the last several hours of it, as though the whole room has been holding some collective breath since 8 o'clock, and has finally been given permission to let it out. You stay at your post through all of it, trimming wicks, watching for smoke, checking the ivy swags along the whole wall one more time near 2 in the morning, when Master Robinet sends word up that his refixing crew has finished their sweep, your body settling into a kind of exhausted rhythm that has more to do with muscle memory than conscious attention, by the time the small hours arrive. Your legs ache from standing on the narrow platform for hours on end. Your eyes burn from the smoke and the heat and the sheer brightness of 13,000 candles worth of light reflected endlessly in 17 mirrored arches. Your palms, where the snuffer tore them earlier, have stiffened into a dull, constant throb that you've simply stopped noticing, except in the moments when you flex your fingers too hard around the snuffer's handle. The guests begin thinning sometime after 3. The crowd along the walls finally loosening enough that you can see individual figure again, rather than one solid mass of silk and candlelight. And by 4 in the morning, with the sky outside the tall windows still black, but the party visibly finally winding down, Master Robinet gives the signal to begin the long, careful work of extinguishing the chandeliers, branch by branch, in a controlled sequence meant to avoid plunging the still half-full gallery into sudden darkness. You work the 4th chandelier last, the one that nearly caught the ivy hours before, snuffing each candle with a careful twist of the brass hook, watching each small flame die, and the thin curl of smoke rise and vanish into the dark space above the scaffold, and you find yourself, in the last of those small deliberate motions, picking up something from the platform floor without entirely deciding to. A single stub of candle, burned down almost to nothing, that fell from its socket sometime in the chaos of the last few hours and rolled to rest against the low rail near where you tied off the ivy. It's nothing, really. A worthless inch of spent wax, indistinguishable from 1,000 others that will be swept up and melted down again tomorrow for the servants' halls. But you find yourself closing your fist around it anyway, feeling the last faint warmth still held in the wax, and slipping it into your coat pocket alongside the coil of spare wick cord. For reasons you don't fully examine at 4 in the morning, with your whole body aching and your mind gone thin and strange with exhaustion, you'll keep it for years, that small ruined stub of beeswax tucked in the bottom of a wooden box, along with a few other things too small and worthless for anyone else to want, and too heavy with memory for you to throw away. A chipped clay button from your father's harness leathers, a small pressed flower Céline gives you years later on the day your first child is born, a coin with a clipped edge that a customer once gave you by mistake in change and that you never quite got around to spending. You'll take the candle stub out sometimes, decades from now, an old man yourself by then, with your own scarred hands and your own stories about fire and crowds and the particular kind of heat that builds slowly in a sealed room until someone has to notice it before it's too late. And you'll turn it over in your fingers and think about the night you spent 30 feet above the most famous party France ever threw, watching a king become for a few hours a stranger, and watching a swag of dried ivy come close enough to a flame that 13,000 people nearly learn the hard way exactly how thin the line runs between spectacle and catastrophe. Master Robinet climbs the scaffold ladder one last time as the final candle on the last chandelier dies, the gallery below settling now into the grey, wax-scented half-light of very early morning, most of the guests gone, servants already moving between the emptying tables to begin the enormous work of clearing 13,000 people's worth of debris before the sun comes up properly. You did well tonight, Fora. He says it plainly, the way he says everything, but he holds your gaze a moment longer than usual when he says it, and you understand that it's meant to be remembered. Better than well. I've had journeymen twice your age freeze up worse than you did tonight, and freezing up is how people die in this work, not carelessness. Carelessness you can train out of a boy. Freezing, when the moment actually comes, that's harder to fix. You didn't freeze. I was afraid, sir. Good. Fear's what makes you fast. It's the boys who aren't afraid of fire who burn palaces down. He allows himself something that isn't quite a smile but moves in that direction. Get some sleep. You've earned it. And 4. The ivy stays between us and Thomas and whoever needs to know to fix it properly. No sense frightening 13,000 people after the fact with the danger they never knew they were in. Some things are better kept quiet. You'll learn in this work which things those are. You climb down from the scaffold as the first grey light starts finding its way through the tall windows. Your legs unsteady after 9 hours standing on a narrow plank 30 feet above the floor. Your whole body one long ache from shoulders to feet. Your hands raw and your eyes burning, and your clothes soaked through with dried sweat and smelling, more strongly than ever, of hot wax and smoke, and the particular thick, close smell of 13,000 human beings packed into a sealed room for the better part of a night. The Hall of Mirrors, in the pale early light, looks like the aftermath of something rather than the scene of a triumph. Wax pooled and hardened across the marble floor in long white streaks, crushed flowers trodden into the parquet, one heel of a lady's slipper abandoned near an overturned chair, half-eaten sugared fruits gone soft and forgotten on a dozen small tables. The whole enormous room stripped, in the grey morning quiet, of every bit of the magic it held only a few hours before. Servants move through it now with brooms and buckets, gathering up the debris of a party that will be talked about. You'll come to understand over the following weeks, for years, for decades, afterward, while the actual physical wreckage of it gets swept into bins before most of the court has even woken to hear the first gossip. You walk back to the apprentices' quarters through service corridors gone quiet and grey with the coming dawn, past kitchen boys already stirring for the morning's work despite having had no night's sleep at all themselves, past a footman asleep sitting upright against a wall, past the particular hush that falls over even the busiest palace in Europe in the hour just before proper daylight, when the night's excesses are finally, mercifully over and the new day's ordinary labour hasn't quite begun. You pass on the way the great courtyard where hundreds of carriages are still queued, waiting to carry their exhausted owners home. Coachmen dozing on their boxes wrapped in horse blankets against the cold. The horses themselves standing patient and steaming in the pale early light, their breath fogging thick in air gone properly frigid now that the sun hasn't yet returned to warm it. A few of the last guests are still leaving even now, stumbling slightly, masks abandoned or hanging loose around their necks, their fine costumes crumpled and stained after 9 hours of dancing and crush and heat, looking, in the grey morning light, considerably less magical than they looked at midnight under 13,000 candles. You watch one woman, still in her huntress costume though her crescent moon headdress has slipped sideways, being handed up into a carriage by a footman who looks nearly as tired as she does, and you wonder briefly whether she has any idea how completely her life is about to change, or whether that understanding will only arrive later, in stages, the way most large changes seem to arrive for everyone you've ever known. Your own legs, by the time you reach the stairs down to the servants' quarters, have gone past aching into something closer to a kind of distant numbness, the particular exhaustion of a body that has been standing and climbing and reaching for the better part of 10 hours straight. Muscles that will make themselves loudly, painfully known again the moment you wake, but that have, for now, simply stopped reporting properly at all. Thomas walks beside you for part of it, equally exhausted, equally wax-stained, and for a while neither of you says anything at all, too tired for conversation, content simply to walk together through the quiet corridors, with the particular wordless companionship of two people who survived the same long, strange night side by side. "You'll tell your grandchildren about this one," he says eventually, as you reach the stairs down to the apprentices' rooms. "The night the King of France danced disguised as a tree, and you were the one who kept the whole gallery from burning down around him. Nobody will believe me. Nobody ever believes the people who actually did the work. That's most of history, probably. The people who did the thing quietly from 30 feet up, while everybody else was down on the floor having the party." He gives you a tired, crooked grin. Doesn't make it less true. You think about that, lying in your narrow bed a few minutes later, too exhausted even to properly wash the wax and smoke smell from your skin before sleep takes you. The small ruined candle stub still in your coat pocket where you left it. A piece of a night that 13,000 people experienced and perhaps a handful truly understood. The weeks that follow settle back into something like ordinary rhythm, though it's a strange kind of ordinary, coloured at the edges by everything that changed on the night of the Yew Ball, without most of the palace quite realising yet how much had changed. You go back to the candle stores, back to the dipping and trimming, and the endless careful work of keeping Versailles lit through the long, dark months of winter. Your hands slowly losing the raw, torn feeling from the snuffer's handle, and settling back into their usual pattern of pale calluses and waxy fingertips. Master Robinet doesn't mention the ivy again, not to you, not in front of the other apprentices, exactly as he said he wouldn't. But you notice, over the following weeks, that every swag of decorative greenery hung anywhere near open flame in any room the department dresses gets checked twice now, and pinned with a different, sturdier fixing than before. And you understand that the lesson travelled, even if the story of exactly how it was learned stayed quiet, the way Master Robinet said some things ought to. The gossip about the huntress, meanwhile, spreads through the palace exactly the way gossip always spreads through a building this size. Servant to servant first, in kitchens and corridors and candle stores, long before it becomes anything anyone upstairs would openly discuss. Within a month you know her name properly, know that she's been given rooms in the palace itself, know that the Queen, a gentle, deeply pious woman, who has, by every account you hear, endured this particular kind of arrangement before with other women, and will endure it again, has said nothing publicly and everything you suspect privately. Within a year, the woman from the masquerade has a title of her own, Marquise de Pompadour, and rooms grander than most dukes could claim, and an influence over the king's affairs that extends, by the time you're old enough to properly understand what you're hearing, well beyond anything a mistress before her ever managed to hold. You'll watch her rise over the years that follow, the way everyone in the household below stairs watches these things, from a careful distance, through fragments of gossip and glimpses across courtyards, understanding perhaps more of the true shape of it than the courtiers themselves manage, because servants see what happens in the corridors and the kitchens and the private apartments that the official history of any reign tends to leave out entirely. You'll watch her build a reputation as a patron of art and architecture that outlasts, by most accounts you hear repeated for decades afterward, the king's own reputation for much of anything except the debts his wars and his pleasures both leave behind. And you'll remember, every single time you hear her name mentioned in a corridor or a kitchen or a candle store, that you saw the very first moment of it. A green tree lifting away its own disguise, 30 feet below your feet, in a room you very nearly failed to keep from burning. You stay in the candle stores 3 more years after that, working your way up from apprentice to journeyman, your hands growing steadily more scarred, your understanding of fire and heat and crowds and the thin margins between spectacle and disaster growing along with them. You train a younger boy eventually, a nervous, undersized child named George, who reminds you uncomfortably of yourself 3 years before, and you find yourself saying Master Robinet's own words to him, nearly unchanged on his first day. Every candle in this palace is a small fire that we've agreed for now to let live in a jar. Forget that, and you'll learn it the hard way. Most boys only need to learn it once. You tell him too, though Master Robinet never told you this part, about the ivy, about the night you nearly weren't fast enough, about how it isn't the flame itself you need to fear so much as the moment you stop watching it closely, because everything else in the room has gotten so beautiful, so loud, so full of light and music and 13,000 happy people, that it becomes easy to forget the flame is still there, still hungry, still one loose swag of dried greenery away from becoming something else entirely. He listens the way you listened 3 years ago, half attending, filing it away without knowing yet which parts he'll need. You don't mind. You know, now, that the lesson doesn't really land the first time it's told. It lands the first time it's lived, 30 feet up, with your own hands shaking and your own heart slamming against your ribs and a length of spare wick cord, the only thing standing between a beautiful party and a very different kind of story. There are other masquerades after that first one, plenty of them, though none quite so enormous, none quite so strange. You work 2 more within the same year, smaller affairs, a few hundred guests rather than 13,000, ordinary evening entertainments that barely raise your pulse anymore after what the Yew Ball taught your body about what real danger actually feels like. You come to recognize the particular signs of a room about to overheat before anyone else in it notices, the specific pitch a crowd's noise takes on once it's packed past comfort, the way candle smoke gathers differently near a ceiling when the air below has stopped moving properly, the exact moment sensed, almost before it's seen, when a decoration hung too close to a flame begins to matter. Master Robinet notices you noticing these things, and within 2 years he's stopped assigning you to the ordinary chandeliers at all, sending you instead, more and more often, to whatever fixture in whatever room carries the greatest risk, because he trusts your eyes there in a way he doesn't yet trust most of the older journeymans. Thomas leaves the department the following spring, apprenticed out instead to a cousin's business trading in fine imported wax down in Paris, and you miss him more than you expected to. The particular ease of working beside someone who understood, without needing it explained, exactly what a night like the Yew Ball cost a person's body and nerves both. You write to him twice a year, roughly, letters carried by whichever household servant happens to be travelling to the city on other business, and he writes back with news of Parisian gossip that reaches him faster from inside the wax trade itself than most of it reaches you inside the palace walls, which is how you learn, 18 months after the ball, that the Marquise de Pompadour has had a private theatre built for herself within the palace, that she's begun collecting painters and philosophers around her table, the way other women collect jewellery, that the Queen has settled, by every account, into a kind of quiet, permanent distance from her husband's affections that nobody at court seems to expect will ever properly close again. You watch all of it unfold over the years, from exactly the vantage point you've always had. Not from the gallery floor, never from the gallery floor, but from 30 feet up, or from a service corridor, or from a candle store window looking out onto a courtyard where something important is happening just out of earshot. You watch the marquise's rooms grow grander. You watch new favourites rise and fall around her, none of them managing to unseat her the way she unseated whoever came before, though you never learn, in any detail that reaches down to your level of the household, quite who that was. You watch wars begin and drag on, watch taxes rise, watch the mood of the court shift, some years, toward a brittleness that the endless parade of balls and suppers and masquerades seems designed, more and more transparently as the years pass, to paper over rather than genuinely celebrate. You work 3 more masquerades in the Hall of Mirrors over the following decade, none of them approaching the scale of the first, though each one carries its own small share of near misses that never quite become disasters, the way Master Robinet always warned you they would if the department kept doing its work properly. A chandelier chain phrased dangerously thin in the winter of your 3rd year as a journeyman. Caught and replaced 2 days before, it would have snapped under load. A drunk guest at a smaller supper party knocks an entire branch of lit candles directly onto a linen tablecloth, and you're close enough, that particular evening, to smother the small resulting flame with your own coat before it can properly catch. Each time you think of the ivy. Each time the same cold flood of understanding arrives a little faster than the last, your body recognizing the shape of the danger before your mind has fully named it, the way a scar recognizes the kind of blow that made it. The wax itself changes too over the years. In small ways you notice because your hands notice them before your mind does. New suppliers, new grades of beeswax coming in from different regions, as old trade arrangements shift and new ones replace them, the price climbing steadily as the years pass and the Crown's endless wars drain money from every department of the household, including yours. You hear, more than once, whispered in the candle stores the way all unwelcome news gets whispered in service corridors long before it's spoken aloud anywhere official, that the king's ministers are looking hard at every possible economy, that even a department as essential as light itself is not entirely safe from a ledger keeper's pen. Nothing comes of it, not in your years there, but the whispering itself tells you something about the slow tightening of a court that once seemed, on the night of the Yew Ball, as though it could burn candles and money both without any bottom to either. You marry, somewhere in among all of it, a laundress named Céline who works in the household linen stores 2 courtyards over from your own, a quiet, practical woman with her own set of ruined hands, hers roughened not by wax but by lye soap and cold water, and the endless scrubbing of other people's sheets. You meet her the ordinary way people in service meet each other, through years of crossing paths in the same corridors and the same servants' hall, and you court her, such as it is, mostly over shared meals and the rare free Sunday afternoon, and when Master Robinet finally gives you leave to marry, a formality he takes more seriously than you expected, questioning you at some length about whether your wages will support a household before he'll sign the paper. You find yourselves given a small set of rooms in the service wing, cramped and cold in winter, but yours, with a door that closes and a hearth that's yours alone to bank each night. Your children, when they come, grow up half in the palace and half in the town, the way most servants' children do, running errands for coin almost as soon as they can walk, learning the geography of Versailles' endless corridors before they learn their letters properly. You tell them eventually the story of the Yew Ball, the way your own memory has smoothed and settled it over the years, not quite as frightened as it actually felt at the time, not quite as uncertain, the way any story told often enough to children starts to take on the clean, purposeful shape of a lesson, rather than the messy, terrifying shape of the thing as it actually happened. Your eldest daughter, sharper than the rest, always asks the same question at the same point in the telling. What would have happened if you hadn't reached the ivy in time? You never quite know how to answer her honestly without frightening her, so mostly you just tell her the truth in the gentlest words you can find. That you don't know, that nobody knows, that some questions are better left as the reason you still check every rope twice than as answers you spend too long imagining. Georges grows into the work the way you grew into it, slowly, through burns and calluses, and the particular patience that handling fire for a living either teaches you or fails to, in which case you don't last long enough in the trade to become anyone's teacher yourself. By the time he's dipping his own tapers steadily enough that Master Robinet trusts him with the fine work, you've become, without quite noticing the transition happen, one of the senior journeymen yourself, the one newer apprentices ask their nervous first day questions to, the one who tells the story about the ivy at the Yew Ball not as a boast, but as exactly what Master Robinet once told you it should be, a warning passed down about how thin the margin runs between a beautiful evening and a catastrophe, and how the only real defence against that thinness is a person willing to keep watching the flame even when everything else in the room has gotten so bright and loud and full of light that watching feels for a moment like the least necessary thing in the world. Tonight, though, tonight you're not 30 feet up, and your hands, while still marked with the same old scars and the same waxy calluses they'll probably carry until the day you die, are finally, blessedly still. The candle stores are quiet at this hour, the day's work done, the vats of wax cooling and hardening in their great copper basins, the tools hung back in their proper places along the wall, the particular hush of a workroom at rest settling over everything the way it settles every night once the last taper of the day has been dipped and trimmed and set aside to cool. You bank the small fire in the corner hearth, the one that keeps the room from freezing entirely through the winter nights, and you sit for a moment on the same overturned crate where old Antoine once told you his story about the crowd that flooded in uninvited years before you were even born into this trade, and you think about how strange it is that the same room can hold so many different nights inside it. The frantic preparation, the terrible, beautiful chaos of the ball itself, and now this, the quiet after. When all that's left of the whole enormous evening is a small stub of burned wax in the bottom of a wooden box and a story you'll tell eventually to a nervous younger boy who reminds you of yourself. You are tired enough tonight, and tired in the particular way of years rather than just one long night, to feel it settle into your bones the way it settles differently now than it did at 15. Not the sharp, immediate exhaustion of a single impossible evening, but the slower, deeper tiredness of a body that has spent years dipping and trimming and climbing and watching flame, that has learned, the hard way, exactly how much attention a small fire deserves, and exactly how quickly beauty and danger can occupy the very same room. You bank the last of the coals, take up your candle, your own, small, ordinary, nothing like the great tapers you dipped for the Hall of Mirrors all those years ago, and make your way toward your bed through corridors gone dark and quiet, past the sleeping household, past the kitchens cooling from the day's fires, past the long gallery windows where, if you looked, you could probably still catch, in your mind's eye if nowhere else, the ghost of 13,000 candles blazing all at once into a room built entirely out of mirrors and light. Céline is already asleep when you reach your own small rooms, one arm flung across the space where you'll lie down beside her. The fire in your own modest hearth. Burn down to a few patient embers that will need only a little coaxing to catch again come morning. You undress quietly in the near dark, the way you've learned to do after years of coming home late from evening work, your body moving through the familiar motions without needing much light to guide it. Coat hung on its peg, boots set by the door, the small wooden box that holds the burned candle stub from the Yew Ball tucked, as it always is, on the narrow shelf above the bed, close enough that you could reach it in the dark without looking, though you rarely take it down anymore. You know what's inside it. You've known for decades now. Some things don't need looking at to be remembered. You're warm enough, fed enough, safe enough tonight, in a way you weren't entirely certain of 30 feet above a crowded gallery with dried ivy swinging toward an open flame. You have hands that know their work and a body that's earned its rest and a small ruined stub of beeswax in a box that holds, if you're honest with yourself, more of that one enormous night than any story you could ever properly tell a stranger. That's enough. The centuries will pass, long after your own hands have finally stopped working and finally stopped aching, long after the last of the wax has worked its way, at last, out from under your fingernails for good. The palace you know will change beyond anything you could imagine tonight, its rooms repurposed, and its candles replaced by lights that burn without flame at all, without wax, without a boy 30 feet up watching for smoke. The king you served without ever once speaking to him directly will pass into history as one entry among many. His name remembered less, in the long run, than the name of the woman he unmasked himself for on a February night in a room full of yew trees. The whole enormous, glittering, dangerous machine of the court will be swept away eventually, the way everything eventually gets swept away. Wax and flowers and crushed slippers alike gathered into bins by the pale light of morning. But somewhere in all of that change, something will stay the same. The particular ache of a body that's worked hard all day and earned its rest. The particular relief of a fire finally, safely banked for the night. The particular quiet of a small room after a very large, very dangerous, very beautiful evening has finally, completely ended. Some things don't change. The need for rest at the end of a long day doesn't change. The weight of a small object kept for decades because it holds a whole night inside it, that doesn't change either. So let it come. Let sleep take you the way it took a 15-year-old boy in the candle stores of Versailles on a February morning nearly 300 years ago. His hands finally, blessedly still, a small stub of burned wax tucked safe in his pocket, the whole enormous, dangerous, glittering night finally completely behind him. Let the light fade. Let the noise of 13,000 voices quiet at last into something like silence. Let your thoughts slow and soften and finally stop. You've earned this rest. Take it. Good night.